You're listening to Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you found your way here tonight, or this morning, or wherever the clock has landed in your part of the world, I'm glad you're here. I'd love to know which country you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. If this story finds you in the right mood, consider subscribing. We share a new story every day, and each one goes somewhere most channels won't. Tonight, we're not chasing shadows or atmosphere. We're looking at something specific, a file system inside the Vatican that was never meant to have a number, never meant to appear in any index, and never meant to be requested by name. This isn't about mystery for mystery's sake. It's about a real bureaucratic decision made by real people to keep certain documents out of the light, not by locking them away, but by making sure no one would ever know how to ask for them. If you keep listening, you're going to understand how that worked and why it mattered. There's no turning back from that kind of knowledge. You're standing in a part of the Vatican Secret Archives, now officially called the Vatican Apostolic Archives since 2019, though the name change didn't alter the silence, where the air smells like old leather and chemically treated paper, and the shelves rise so high that even with the rolling ladders, some sections feel designed to discourage retrieval. It's late afternoon, and the reading room is nearly empty. You've been granted access, which means you filled out the forms months in advance, provided letters of reference, specified your research topic with enough precision to satisfy the prefect, and agreed to rules that include no photography, no removal of documents, and no citation of certain materials without explicit written permission. You're here because you're writing about a specific diplomatic event in the 1920s, and you've been told that a file exists. Someone mentioned it in a footnote, vaguely, in a journal article published in 1974. But when you submitted your formal request, the archivist looked at you for a long moment and said the file was not cataloged in the system, not missing, not restricted, not cataloged. That's the phrase you're carrying now as you sit at the wooden desk under the high windows, waiting for the archivist to return with whatever they've decided you're allowed to see. The Vatican's archival system, at least the modern version of it, operates on a principle that sounds straightforward. Every document is assigned a fondo, a collection designation, then a series number, then a busta, which is a folder or box, and finally a fascicolo, which is the individual file. This system was formalized in stages throughout the 20th century, with major organizational reforms in 1924 under Pope Pius V and again in 1981 under John Paul II, when the archives were reclassified and certain materials were transferred between fondi to reflect updated historical interpretations. But what you're learning, slowly, as the archivist returns and sets a thin folder on the desk without meeting your eyes, is that not every document was given a number. Some were marked non da catalogare, not to be catalogued, which meant they existed within the physical space of the archives but were excluded from the official index, and therefore could not be requested by a researcher unless that researcher already knew the document's exact description, its physical location, and often the name of the person who had filed it. The folder in front of you is unmarked except for a handwritten note in Italian on the cover, Corrispondenza riservata, non inclusa nell'inventario, 1922, reserved correspondence, not included in the inventory, 1922. You open it carefully, and inside are 6 letters, typed on thin, onion skin paper, signed by a Vatican diplomat whose name you recognize from your earlier research, but whose role in this specific negotiation was never mentioned in any of the published histories. The letters discuss a proposed agreement between the Holy See and a European government regarding the repatriation of religious artifacts seized during the First World War. But the tone is strange, formal on the surface, but with phrases that suggest something else was being negotiated in parallel, something that required this correspondence to remain off the books. One letter refers to the matter we discussed in person, which will not be reflected in the official minutes, and another mentions an understanding that must remain unofficial until the political situation stabilizes. You read slowly, taking notes by hand, as required, and you begin to understand that what you're holding is not a secret in the melodramatic sense. There's no conspiracy here, no hidden crime, but rather a document that was deliberately kept out of the archival system because its existence would have complicated the official narrative that the Vatican wanted to present about its wartime neutrality and its post-war diplomatic priorities. The decision not to catalog it wasn't made by a single person in a moment of drama. It was made by a mid-level archivist, probably in the late 1920s, following an unwritten guideline that certain sensitive correspondence should be filed separately, without index numbers, so the future researchers wouldn't accidentally stumble upon materials that might contradict the carefully constructed image of papal diplomacy that was being built in the published record. This wasn't censorship in the sense of destruction or denial. It was a quieter form of control, a way of making sure that the archival record could be cited as complete and transparent while still preserving the institution's ability to manage which stories got told and in what order. The specific mechanism for this was simple. When a document arrived at the archives, it was reviewed by the prefect or a senior archivist, and if it was deemed too sensitive for general cataloging, it was placed in a separate storage area, sometimes a locked cabinet within a larger archival room, sometimes a shelf in a corridor that wasn't included in the public floor plans, and marked with a handwritten note indicating that it should not be added to the printed or typed inventories that researchers used to navigate the collection. Over time, as the archives grew and as different prefects implemented different policies, these uncatalogued files accumulated in irregular patterns, and by the mid-20th century, there were entire fondi, unofficial ones, never named, that existed in a kind of bureaucratic limbo, known to senior staff but invisible to visiting scholars. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this system was ever formalized in a written directive, or whether it evolved organically as a kind of institutional habit, passed down through training and mentorship rather than through explicit policy, but the result was the same. A shadow archive within the archive, not hidden in any dramatic sense, but rendered effectively invisible through the simple act of omission from the catalog. You finish reading the letters and close the folder, and the archivist returns to collect it without asking if you found what you needed. You didn't, not really, because what you needed was context, and context is exactly what the cataloging system was designed to withhold. The letters tell you that a negotiation happened, but they don't tell you why it had to remain unofficial, or what the consequences were when the agreement was never formalized, or whether anyone at the time objected to the decision to keep this correspondence out of the record. You could request more files, but you'd need to know what to ask for, and the only way to know that would be to have already seen the materials you're trying to find. It's a perfect bureaucratic loop, not born of malice, but of an institutional commitment to managing its own historical image. And as you leave the reading room and walk back through the long stone corridors toward the exit, you realize that what you've just encountered isn't an anomaly. It's the system working exactly as it was designed to work, protecting the institution's prerogative to decide not just what gets preserved, but what gets found. You're back in the archives 3 weeks later, this time with a different strategy. You've spent the interim reading everything you could find about the Vatican's archival reforms in the 1920s and 1930s, and you've learned that the period when your uncatalogued letters were filed coincides almost exactly with a major reorganization effort that was initiated by Pope Pius V in 1924. Shortly after the opening of certain sections of the archives to qualified researchers for the first time in the institution's history. The reform wasn't just administrative, it was ideological, tied to Pius XV's broader vision of the Church as a modern institution that could engage with scholarship and historical inquiry, without compromising its authority or its doctrinal positions. The practical side of this vision was a new cataloging system, overseen by a Jesuit archivist named Angelo Mercati, who was appointed prefect of the archives in 1925, and who spent the next 2 decades standardizing the classification of documents, creating typed inventories, and establishing formal procedures for researcher access. But what you've also learned, from a footnote in a 1960s Italian academic journal is that Mercati's reforms included a category of materials designated as riservato alla consultazione del prefetto, reserved for consultation by the prefect only, which meant that these documents were catalogued internally within the prefect's private records, but were not included in the inventories made available to researchers. This category was used for materials deemed too sensitive for general access, including correspondence involving living individuals, documents related to ongoing diplomatic negotiations, and files that contained information that might embarrass the Church or complicate its relationships with secular governments. The physical reality of this system was a set of locked wooden cabinets located in a small office adjacent to the main reading room, where Mercati and his successors kept the internal indexes that listed these reserved materials. You haven't been able to see those cabinets, they're not part of the public access areas, but you found references to them in the memoirs of a French historian who was granted special access in the 1950s and who described the experience of being led into the prefect's office and shown a handwritten ledger that listed files by subject and date, but without the standard archival codes that would allow them to be requested through normal channels. The historian wrote that he was allowed to take notes on the ledger's contents, but was not permitted to photograph it or to request any of the files it listed, and he concluded, somewhat bitterly, that the Vatican's commitment to archival transparency was more symbolic than real, a way of claiming openness while retaining ultimate control over which documents entered the historical record. You've also learned, from a more recent article published in 2003, that this system of reserved materials was quietly expanded in the 1930s and 1940s as the Vatican's diplomatic activities grew more complex and as the political situation in Europe made certain kinds of correspondence, particularly anything involving negotiations with fascist governments or discussions of Jewish refugees, too sensitive to risk exposing to researchers, even decades after the fact. The expansion wasn't announced or documented in any official way. It simply happened as a practical response to the reality that the Vatican was operating as both a religious institution and a sovereign state, and that its archives contained materials that served both historical and diplomatic functions. The result was a two-tiered system, a public archive with printed inventories and formal access procedures that gave researchers the impression of comprehensive access to the historical record, and a shadow archive maintained internally that preserved the institution's ability to manage which parts of its history could be studied and which parts would remain effectively invisible until the Church decided otherwise. This dual system was maintained not through dramatic secrecy or explicit censorship, but through the mundane mechanics of bureaucratic classification, through the decision made by archivists and prefects over and over again to mark certain files as not to be catalogued or reserved for internal consultation or to be reviewed before access is granted, phrases that sound procedural and neutral but that functioned in practice as a form of historical gatekeeping. The specific consequence of this system, which you're beginning to understand as you sit in the reading room with a new stack of files that may or may not be related to your original research question, is that entire categories of Vatican activity, particularly anything involving sensitive diplomacy, internal church politics, or interactions with controversial political regimes, remain fundamentally unstudied, not because the documents don't exist, but because they can't be found without insider knowledge of how the uncatalogued materials are organized. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents a deliberate effort to control the historical narrative or simply a pragmatic response to the challenges of managing a massive archive with limited resources and competing institutional priorities. But the effect is the same either way. The history that gets written is the history that the archival system makes visible, and the history that remains invisible is the history that the institution has chosen, consciously or not, to defer. You're thinking about this as you read through a file of diplomatic correspondence from 1938, all of it properly cataloged and indexed, and all of it conspicuously bland, formal exchanges about protocol and procedure, with no hint of the political tensions that you know from other sources were dominating Vatican diplomacy at the time. The letters are real, the dates are accurate, the signatures are authentic, but the file feels incomplete, like a script with all the crucial scenes removed. You make a note to request additional materials, but you already know what the archivist will tell you. There are no additional materials in the catalog. And if there are materials that aren't in the catalog, well, you'd need to know what you're looking for before you could ask for them. And knowing what you're looking for would require having already seen the materials you're trying to find. It's the same loop, refined over decades into a system that protects institutional prerogatives while maintaining the appearance of scholarly access. And as you sit there in the quiet reading room, surrounded by carefully organized files that tell you almost nothing about what you actually came here to learn, you realize that you're not just encountering a historical puzzle, you're encountering a system that was designed, layer by layer, to make sure that certain puzzles would never be solved. You're deep into the research now, 6 months after your first visit, and you've developed what you think of as a kind of archival peripheral vision, the ability to notice what's missing from the catalog, to spot the gaps where documents should exist but don't, to recognize the patterns that suggest when a file has been deliberately excluded from the indexing system. You've learned that the Vatican's approach to cataloging wasn't uniform across different fondi or different time periods. Instead, it evolved in response to specific historical pressures and institutional needs, which means that the uncatalogued materials aren't randomly distributed. They cluster around certain topics and certain moments. One of those moments is the period immediately after the Lateran Treaty of 1929, when the Vatican became a sovereign state and suddenly had to manage diplomatic relations, financial arrangements, and legal agreements that involved secular governments and international organizations. The treaty itself is well documented, of course. It's one of the most studied events in 20th century Catholic history. But what you're finding in the margins of the cataloged materials are hints of parallel negotiations and unofficial understandings that weren't included in the treaty's final text and weren't fully documented in the diplomatic correspondence that researchers can access. You found references in letters that are cataloged to supplementary arrangements and private assurances and matters to be resolved through direct consultation, all phrases that point toward agreements that were kept off the record. And you've started to compile a list of files that you think must exist somewhere in the archives, but that don't appear in any inventory. The problem is that you can't request a file that doesn't have a catalog number, and you can't find out if a file has been marked not to be cataloged without asking the prefect directly. And asking the prefect directly means revealing that you know about the system of uncatalogued materials, which might get your access revoked or might get you marked as a troublesome researcher whose future requests will be reviewed with extra scrutiny. So you're working indirectly, reading around the edges, looking for the places where the archival record seems to thin out or contradict itself, and hoping that eventually you'll find a thread you can pull that will lead you to the materials you're looking for. One of those threads appears in a file of internal church correspondence from 1931, which you requested because it was listed in the catalog as containing routine administrative communications, but which turns out to include a brief exchange between two Vatican officials about the special collection being maintained in the prefect's office. The exchange is cryptic, just a few lines in the middle of a longer letter about staffing and budget. But it confirms what you've suspected, that there was, in fact, a formalized system for keeping certain documents out of the general catalog, and that this system was known to senior officials, and was considered, at least by some, to be a necessary tool for protecting the Church's institutional interests. The letter doesn't explain what those interests were, or which specific documents were being held in the special collection, but it does mention that the collection was being reorganized in preparation for a possible inspection by a Vatican commission that was reviewing archival practices, which suggests that even within the Church there was some concern about whether the system of uncatalogued materials could withstand scrutiny. You make a note of this and keep reading, and a few pages later you find another reference, this time in a memo from the prefect to the Vatican Secretary of State, explaining that certain files from the 1920s had been reclassified as not suitable for general consultation and had been moved to a storage area in the Torre dei Venti, one of the Vatican's oldest buildings, where they would be kept pending further review. The memo is dated 1933, which means these files have been in limbo for more than 90 years now, and as far as you can tell, no further review ever happened, or if it did, the results were never documented in any materials that researchers can access. The Torre dei Venti itself is a real place. You've read about it in architectural histories of the Vatican, a 16th century tower that was originally used as an astronomical observatory and later repurposed for various administrative functions, including, apparently, the storage of sensitive archival materials. You've never been inside it, and you don't know anyone who has, but the fact that it's mentioned in this memo tells you that the system of uncatalogued materials wasn't just an abstract bureaucratic category. It had a physical location, a specific place where documents were being held outside the normal archival workflow. And that place was apparently still in use in the 1930s, possibly later. The consequence of this, which is becoming clearer the more you read, is that the Vatican's archival system isn't really a single system at all. It's a collection of overlapping systems, some official and transparent, others informal and invisible, all of them serving the same basic function of managing the institution's historical record in a way that protects its authority and its ability to control how its past is understood. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this kind of selective preservation represents a betrayal of the archival mission, which is supposed to be about preserving the past as completely and accurately as possible, or whether it's simply a realistic acknowledgement of the fact that archives are always shaped by institutional interests and that perfect transparency is an ideal that no institution, religious or secular, has ever fully achieved. But for you, sitting in the reading room with a stack of files that raise more questions than they answer, the disagreement feels academic. What matters is that you're trying to write a history that depends on documents that you can't access, and that the reason you can't access them isn't that they've been destroyed or lost, but that they've been deliberately kept out of the system that researchers use to find materials, which means that the history you're able to write will inevitably be incomplete, shaped not by what happened, but by what the archival system allows you to see. You've started to think of your research as an exercise in negative space, in mapping the outline of what's missing and trying to infer from the shape of the gaps what must have been there. It's frustrating, intellectually unsatisfying, but it's also the only approach that makes sense given the constraints you're working under. And as you close the last file in today's stack and prepare to leave, you realize that you've learned more about how the Vatican manages its history than you have about the specific historical event you came here to study, and that this knowledge, uncomfortable as it is, might be the most important thing you take away from this research. You're in a different part of the archives now, a section that was open to researchers in 2020 when Pope Francis authorized the release of materials from the pontificate of Pius XIII, covering the years 1939 to 1958. This opening was major news in the historical community. It had been anticipated for decades, and when it finally happened, hundreds of researchers descended on the Vatican, all of them hoping to find documents that would shed new light on the Church's actions during World War II, particularly regarding its response to the Holocaust and its diplomatic relationships with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. You're here for the same reason, and you've spent the last 2 months working through files that are, for the most part, exactly what you expected. Diplomatic correspondence, reports from papal nuncios, internal memos about refugee assistance, all of it carefully preserved and properly cataloged. But you've also noticed something strange, which is that certain files that you know existed because they're referenced in other documents or because they were mentioned in testimonies given after the war, don't appear in the catalog or appear but are listed as not available for consultation without any explanation of why or when they might become available. One of these files is a set of reports from the papal nuncio in Berlin, covering the period from late 1941 to early 1943, which were sent to the Vatican because they're mentioned in a letter from the Secretary of State that you found in a different fondo. The letter refers to the reports from Berlin that we discussed in yesterday's meeting and includes specific references to information that must have been in those reports. Details about deportations, about the treatment of Jews in occupied territories, about conversations between Vatican diplomats and German officials. But when you request the reports themselves, you're told that they're not in the catalog. Not missing, not destroyed, not restricted, not in the catalog. It's the same phrase you heard on your first visit 5 years ago now, and it still means the same thing. The documents exist somewhere, in some form, but they're not part of the archival system that researchers can access. You've become more persistent over the years, though, more willing to push back against bureaucratic deflection, and this time, when the archivist tells you the reports aren't cataloged, you ask why not, and whether there's any record of what happened to them. The archivist looks uncomfortable and says he'll check with the prefect, and you spend the next hour sitting in the reading room, watching other researchers work their way through files, wondering whether you've just ended your access by asking the wrong question. But the archivist returns, eventually, and tells you that the reports were reviewed during the 2020 opening process and were determined to contain information that was still too sensitive for public access, so they've been held back pending further review. He doesn't say what makes them sensitive, or who made the determination, or when the further review might happen, and when you ask, he just shakes his head and says, that's all the information he has. You thank him and go back to the files you're allowed to see, but the conversation stays with you because it confirms what you've been suspecting for years now, that the Vatican's archival openings, as significant as they are still selective, still managed by the institution's own assessment of what can be revealed and what needs to remain hidden, and that this assessment is based not on objective historical criteria, but on the Church's ongoing institutional interests and its concern about how certain documents might be interpreted or used by researchers and journalists and political actors who don't share the Vatican's perspective. The specific mechanism for this, which you've learned about from conversations with other researchers and from reading administrative documents that occasionally slip through the cataloging filters, is a review process that happens before materials are officially open, during which teams of archivists and church officials go through the files page by page, identifying anything that might be problematic, a term that's used without much definition, but that seems to include anything that contradicts the official Vatican narrative about a particular event, anything that reveals internal disagreements or conflicts within the church hierarchy, anything that might embarrass living individuals or their families, and anything that could be used to support legal claims or political arguments that the church opposes. Documents flagged as problematic are then separated from the main collection and either reclassified as restricted, which means they get a catalog entry but with an access block, or marked as not to be cataloged, which means they disappear from the researcher's view entirely. The decision about which approach to use seems to depend on how visible the document is. If it's referenced in other materials that researchers can access, it gets restricted so that there's at least an acknowledgement of its existence. If it's not referenced anywhere, or if the references can be explained away, it gets uncatalogued so that researchers won't even know to ask for it. This dual-track approach gives the Vatican the best of both worlds. It can claim that it's opening its archives and allowing scholars to study its history, while still maintaining control over which parts of that history actually become available for study. And it can do this without having to explicitly censor or suppress documents, simply by using the archival system itself as a filter. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this kind of selective access is fundamentally different from the total secrecy that characterized the archives for most of their history, or whether it's just a more sophisticated version of the same thing, but for you, trying to reconstruct what the Vatican knew about the Holocaust, and when it knew it. The distinction doesn't matter much. What matters is that key documents are missing from the record you're able to access, and that those documents are missing not by accident, but by design. You found, in the files you can see, plenty of evidence that Vatican officials were informed about the deportations and the killings, that they received detailed reports from their diplomats and from Catholic clergy in occupied territories, and that they discussed these reports in meetings and in correspondence with each other. What you haven't found, and what you suspect is in the uncatalogued files, is evidence of how they responded to that information, what decisions they made, what debates they had, what instructions they gave to their representatives in the field. The cataloged files show you that the Vatican knew, but they don't show you what the Vatican did with that knowledge. And that gap between knowing and acting, between receiving information and responding to it, is exactly where the historical arguments are, where the scholarly debates happen, where the moral questions get asked. By keeping those documents out of the catalog, the Vatican is effectively keeping those questions out of the historical record, or at least deferring them until some future moment when the institution decides it's ready to let researchers examine the full documentary evidence. The consequence of this, which you're living with now as you try to write about a period that you can't fully document, is that any history of the Vatican during World War II is going to be incomplete, shaped as much by what's missing as by what's present, and that this incompleteness isn't a neutral gap in the record. It's a strategic gap, created and maintained by the institution itself to protect its historical image and its moral authority. You're at home now, months after your last visit to the Vatican, working through your notes and trying to write something coherent about what you've learned, and you keep coming back to a single question. Why does the uncatalogued system persist? The Vatican has been opening its archives gradually since the late 19th century, with each new opening presented as evidence of the Church's commitment to transparency and historical honesty, and yet the system of excluding certain documents from the catalog, a system that was formalized in the 1920s and expanded in the 1930s and 1940s, is still in place, still functioning, still shaping which documents researchers can access and which ones remain invisible. You've tried to find a clear explanation for this, something written down in an official policy document or explained in an interview with a Vatican official, but what you've found instead is a kind of institutional inertia, a sense that the system exists because it's always existed, because it serves purposes that are understood implicitly rather than stated explicitly, and because dismantling it would require the Church to confront uncomfortable questions about what it's been hiding and why. The closest you've come to an explanation is in a book published in 2015 by an Italian historian who spent decades working in the Vatican archives and who wrote with a mix of frustration and resignation that the uncatalogued system reflects the Church's fundamental ambivalence about historical research, that the Vatican wants to be seen as open to scholarship, wants to benefit from the legitimacy that comes from allowing historians to study its past, but also wants to retain control over how that past is interpreted, wants to make sure that the historical narrative ultimately serves the Church's institutional interests rather than challenging them. This ambivalence, the historian argued, is built into the archival system itself, through mechanisms like the reserved collections, the internal inventories that researchers can't access, the review processes that happen behind closed doors, and most fundamentally, through the practice of not cataloging certain documents, which allows the Vatican to claim that it's making materials available while still keeping the most sensitive materials out of reach. The specific physical reality of this system, which you've pieced together from multiple sources, includes not just the cabinets in the prefect's office and the storage areas in the Torre dei Venti, but also a network of smaller repositories scattered throughout the Vatican's administrative buildings, offices where individual departments keep their own files, sometimes for decades, before transferring them to the central archives, and sometimes not transferring them at all, instead maintaining their own private collections that are never cataloged and never made available to researchers. This decentralized approach means that there's no single location where all the uncatalogued materials are kept, no master list of what's been excluded from the main catalog, and no way for researchers to know with any certainty what they're missing. You've heard stories from other historians about stumbling onto important documents by accident, about mentioning a research topic to a Vatican official and being told, off the record, that relevant materials exist but aren't in the archives, about being shown files that were never supposed to be seen, and then being asked not to cite them or describe them in publications. These stories suggest that the system of uncatalogued materials isn't entirely closed, that there are informal channels through which certain researchers, under certain circumstances, can gain access to documents that are officially invisible. But these channels depend on personal relationships, on the Vatican's assessment of whether a researcher is trustworthy and sympathetic to the Church's perspective, and on a researcher's willingness to accept conditions and restrictions that would be unacceptable in any secular archive. The consequence of this, which has shaped decades of scholarship on Vatican history, is that the most important research on the Church's modern political and diplomatic activities has been done by scholars who are either Catholic themselves or who are willing to work within the constraints that the Vatican imposes, which means that critical perspectives that might challenge the Church's official narratives or ask uncomfortable questions about its historical actions, are systematically disadvantaged by the archival system itself. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this represents a fundamental corruption of the historical process or whether it's simply a reflection of the fact that the Vatican is a unique institution, both a religious organization and a sovereign state, and that it has legitimate reasons for managing its historical materials differently than a secular government or a university archive would. But for you, trying to make sense of what you've seen over years of research, the disagreement feels beside the point. What matters is that the system exists, that it works, that it shapes historical knowledge in ways that serve the Church's interests, and that it does so not through dramatic acts of censorship or suppression, but through the mundane bureaucratic process of deciding which documents get catalog numbers and which ones get marked not to be cataloged. You've started to think of the Vatican archives not as a repository of the past, but as an active participant in the construction of historical memory, an institution that uses its control over documents to shape what can be known and what must remain uncertain, and that exercises this control not despite its claims to transparency, but through them, by creating a system that appears open while remaining in its essential structure closed. The most striking thing about this system, from your perspective now, is how normalized it's become. How many historians have learned to work around it, to accept its limitations as simply part of the research process, to write their histories knowing that key documents are missing, and that those documents are missing by design. You've done it yourself. You've written articles and book chapters based on the materials you could access, acknowledging in footnotes that certain files weren't available, but proceeding with your analysis anyway. Using the documents, you had to construct narratives that you knew were incomplete, but that were the best you could do given the constraints. And every time you've done that, you've participated in the system, you've helped to normalize it, you've contributed to a body of scholarship that reflects not what actually happened, but what the Vatican has chosen to let researchers see. There's no easy way out of this, no simple solution that would make the archival system more transparent or more accountable, because the problem isn't just technical or administrative, it's political and institutional, rooted in the Church's understanding of its own history as something that belongs to the institution rather than to the public, something that can be managed and controlled to serve the Church's ongoing mission rather than something that should be preserved and made available according to neutral, objective standards. The Vatican's archival reforms, from the 1920s to the present, have always been framed as steps toward greater openness. But what you've learned is that each reform has also included mechanisms for preserving institutional control, for making sure that the most sensitive materials remain out of reach, and that this pattern isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's what the system was designed to do from the beginning. You're back at your desk now, late at night, looking at a document you managed to photograph during your last visit to the Vatican, before you understood that what you were seeing wasn't supposed to be photographed, wasn't supposed to be seen at all, really, except that the archivist made a mistake and brought you the wrong file. A file that was marked non da catalogare on the cover, but that somehow ended up in the stack of materials you'd requested. You didn't realize the mistake until you were halfway through reading it, and by then you'd already taken notes, already committed key passages to memory, and when you asked the archivist about it later, casually, trying not to reveal that you knew it was the wrong file, he went pale and told you there must have been a mix-up in the storage area, and could you please return your notes and confirm that you hadn't photographed anything? You said yes, of course, and you handed over the notebook where you'd been writing, but you'd been taking notes on your laptop too, and those notes are still there, encrypted, backed up, and now you're looking at them and trying to decide what to do with what you've learned. The document was a memo from 1942, written by a mid-level Vatican official to the Secretary of State, describing a meeting with a German diplomat in which the diplomat had requested that the Vatican refrain from making public statements about the deportations of Jews from occupied territories, arguing that such statements would complicate Germany's diplomatic relationships and might provoke retaliation against Catholic institutions in German-controlled areas. The memo was remarkable not because it revealed anything dramatically new. Historians have long known that the Vatican faced pressure from Axis powers to remain silent about the Holocaust, but because it included the official's own commentary on the request, in which he argued clearly and explicitly that the Vatican should comply with the German request, not because it agreed with German policy, but because maintaining the Church's diplomatic relationships and protecting its institutional presence in Europe was more important than making public protests that would, in his assessment, do nothing to stop the deportations and might actually make the situation worse for Catholics living under German occupation. The memo included a handwritten note at the bottom, apparently added by the Secretary of State or by Pope Pius X himself, that said simply, "Agreed, proceed as discussed," which suggested that this argument had been accepted, that the decision to remain publicly silent had been made not out of ignorance or indifference, but out of a calculated assessment of the Church's institutional interests. What made the memo uncatalogued, you realized as you read it, wasn't that it contained information that would embarrass the Vatican. There are plenty of cataloged documents that show the Church in an unflattering light, but that it made explicit a decision-making process that the Vatican has always preferred to keep implicit, that it showed Church officials choosing institutional preservation over moral witness in a context where that choice had life and death consequences for the people the Church claimed to protect. The memo didn't prove that the Vatican was complicit in the Holocaust or that it didn't care about Jewish suffering. In fact, other parts of the memo made it clear that the official who wrote it was deeply troubled by what was happening. But it did show that when faced with a choice between speaking out and staying silent, between moral action and institutional caution, the Church chose caution and chose it consciously after careful deliberation for reasons that were institutional rather than theological. And that's what the uncatalogued system exists to protect. Not secrets in the melodramatic sense, not evidence of crimes or conspiracies, but evidence of the mundane, bureaucratic ways that institutions make choices that prioritize their own survival and stability over other values, even values that those institutions claim to hold sacred. You're sitting with this knowledge now, trying to decide whether to include the memo in your research, knowing that doing so might cost you your access to the Vatican archives, might damage your reputation in a scholarly community that depends on maintaining good relationships with archival institutions, might even expose you to legal action if the Vatican decides that you violated the terms of your research agreement by photographing materials without permission. But you're also thinking about the hundreds of other researchers who are working in the archives right now, who are writing histories based on cataloged materials, who are reaching conclusions about the Vatican's wartime actions that are shaped by what the archival system shows them and by what it doesn't show them, and who have no idea that documents like the one you're looking at exist, that there's a whole parallel archive of materials that were deliberately excluded from the catalog precisely because they complicate the narratives that the cataloged materials support. Some historians quietly disagree about whether it's ever ethical to cite materials that you weren't supposed to see, whether the principles of historical accuracy outweigh the obligations you accept when you agree to follow an archive's rules. But for you, the question has become less about ethics in the abstract and more about what kind of history you want to write, what kind of scholar you want to be, whether you're willing to participate in a system that shapes historical knowledge to serve institutional interests, or whether you're going to push back against that system, even if it means risking your career and your access to the materials you need to do your work. The memo is real. The decision it describes was real. The consequences of that decision were real. And the fact that it was marked not to be cataloged tells you everything you need to know about how the Vatican thinks about its own history, about which parts of that history can be safely revealed and which parts need to remain hidden. Not forever, maybe, but long enough that the people who made those decisions are dead, long enough that the institutional context has changed, long enough that the Church can acknowledge its past mistakes without those mistakes threatening its present authority. You close your laptop and sit in the dark for a while, thinking about all the historians who've worked in the Vatican archives over the decades, all the documents they've seen and all the documents they haven't seen, all the histories they've written that are incomplete because the archival system made them incomplete. And you realize that what you're dealing with isn't just an archival problem or a historical problem. It's a problem about truth and power, about who gets to decide what counts as knowable and what remains uncertain, about the ways that institutions use their control over the past to shape how they're understood in the present. The file marked not to be cataloged isn't an exception to the Vatican's archival system. It's the key to understanding how that system really works, what it's designed to do, and why. Despite decades of reforms and openings and promises of transparency, it continues to function exactly as it was designed to function, protecting the institution's prerogative to manage its own historical memory, one uncatalogued file at a time. If you've stayed with me through this, through all these sections and all these details about catalog codes and storage systems and bureaucratic decisions, then you've learned something that most people never quite grasp about how history gets made and how institutions protect themselves by controlling what can be known about their past. I hope this story found you at a time when you could really sit with it, when you could think about what it means that some of the most important documents are the ones that were never given numbers, never indexed, never made findable. If this kind of story matters to you, if you want to keep hearing about the real mechanisms behind Vatican Mysteries and Vatican Secrets, not just the atmosphere but the actual systems, then I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. We share a new story like this every day, each one going somewhere specific, somewhere documented. And if this one resonated with you, a like helps others find it too. I'll be back tomorrow night with another story, another corner of the Vatican archives where the documents tell us as much by their absence as by their presence. Until then, wherever you are, whatever time it is, I hope you sleep well.